There is a lack of understanding across Britain of how the structures of racism function and how those structures have existed across history. And without having a foundation to understand the histories of British racism, it's impossible to understand the complex realities of racism today. In these two videos, we're going to speak to academics from around the university to help us examine the history of racism and track their impact on modern Britain. Colonialism is a topic that's barely taught in schools or talked about in society, despite it being a huge part of our history. But it's a history that happened surprisingly recently, and its effects are still being felt today. So before we start, what actually is colonialism?
I think that's a very, very interesting question, and it's also very loaded.
A very big question, and not perhaps as straightforward as we might think.
Well, so simply put, colonialism is a system of government in which a group of people from one part of the world go to another part of the world and take control of the territories in that other part of the world.
Occupation of another territory, either directly or indirectly.
It's been such a major part of our history for the last 300-400 years.
In the case of England, for example, then the earliest English colonisation is in Ireland from the early 17th century. There's a whole series of English settlements that are established both in North America and in the Caribbean colonies, but Barbados initially.
And there were different kinds of colonies. So there were settler colonies, so for example, British North America, Australia, Canada.
Whereas in the areas described as colonial territories themselves, so Pacific Islands, some of the African colonies, Kenya, Nigeria, there's much more direct control over government from the centre in Britain.
Colonies which were mainly administered territories for economic exploitation, so like British India, or maritime enclaves like Hong Kong, Malta, Singapore.
And quite a lot of things come with that in many ways, culture, religion, to be specific, Christianity in particular.
But it's very much about a process of economic exploitation. And so raw materials and products are being garnered from colonial territories.
You know, for example, the Industrial Revolution in this country was kind of driven by resources that came from the colonies.
So when we say colonization, it doesn't just mean sitting in or just taking of resources. It's complete change of certain people's life.
There are almost very few parts of the world that weren't touched by it.
In terms of direct rule, they ruled only about 30 to 40%, but they ruled a lot of other areas indirectly. It will come to somewhere around 80% actually.
Colonialism was a brutal system whereby many lost their homes and lives. It created mass displacement, humanitarian crises, tensions over territory, and ultimately changed people's lives. And while this might seem like ancient history, it's surprising how recently some of these countries gained their independence.
So it is definitely significant, from the point of view that if we're talking about most African countries have been independent 55, 60 years, around that. That's a very short time in a nation's history, actually. It's really nothing.
So in the late 1940s, there were a number of South Asian territories which gained their independence, so in Sri Lanka, in India and Pakistan.
The decolonization of Africa happened more in the 60s, so that's even more recent. So people would have parents born.
The fact that in many African countries it's happened as late as the 1960s and 70s means that the legacy is still very recent.
Through the 1970s into the early 80s, in fact, then the rest of the British colonial possessions gained their independence. I remember watching them lowering the flag that would have been Hong Kong.
But these countries didn't gain their independence from goodwill alone. Huge amounts of resistance, ranging from political movements to armed uprisings, were needed to gain their independence.
There were two main ways of doing this. The first was armed struggle, the second was sort of unarmed and through political negotiation.
One of the ways in which they did it was through organized national movements. You had parties such as the Indian National Congress in India. You had a similar party in South Africa, for example.
The struggle within those countries actually added a lot to what's actually been going on in terms of struggle for independence.
By the 30s, 40s, and certainly by the late 40s, early 1950s, there was already a significant group of intellectuals, usually, in many African states who started contesting the whole concept of colonialism and saying, look, this has to come to an end.
Political negotiation went hand in hand with mass civil disobedience, sort of non-violent protest pioneered by Gandhi under the Indian National Congress. But it would be wrong to say that this is the only form of challenge to imperialism and colonialism in India. We also had very strong movements of strategic violence.
There are a number of clear kind of set-piece events that many of us will have heard of. So the so-called Indian Mutiny, which indeed has a very significant impact. There are a range of other violent uprisings, civil unrest, military combat.
So I think it's always a culmination of these factors, because those who are pushing through violence will jolt the administration into a response, and then those who are professing non-violence will also get an edge.
But even when these countries gained their independence a few decades ago, it was not an easy path to build back their country.
What really matters is that a lot of these countries started from, with incredible obstacles in front of them. So colonialism was an exploitative system, an economically exploitative system, which essentially wanted territories that would supply cheap raw materials to fund British economic growth. That model of economic dependence has continued up till today. And 60 to 70% of African exports to Europe remain raw materials, primary products, whereas around 70% of European exports to Africa are finished products, manufactured products, which are of course more expensive products, more high value products. So that economic structure of the relationship has remained.
So it's interesting that with formal political independence, how much of this cultural imperialism can be seen to change. So in India, English is still the language of mobility. If you can speak in English, you can mask your low social origin. So if you can speak in good English, you can climb the rungs in society.
And it's no surprise we aren't talking about this. As the colonies gained their independence, attempts were made to erase this history by destroying and hiding documents. Even today, we don't know the full extent of the damage done by the British Empire. So after all this, what are the lasting effects of colonialism?
Wow. I mean, when you ask that question, my heart just really beat very fast. That is what makes somebody like me, we're talking about life. It's very, very difficult. It defines people. It's almost very difficult to detach colonialism from race or racism.
So I think it's very important to reflect on this history because it shapes who we are today. And it also shapes a global inequality today, economic inequality, because the roots of that are in colonialism as well.
Really, financial power is the ultimate power. All other powers flow from that. Whether we're talking about the kind of weapons you can have, the kind of systems you can have in your country, the kind of infrastructure you have, everything costs money. We have the huge domination, especially of former colonial powers who tend to be the richest countries even within the West. And then within here, if we look at Britain, you'll find that, for instance, median household wealth in white households is roughly around £300,000, I think. Whereas in black African households, it's around £34,000. So you see that difference I'm talking about.
The effects are very clear in the diversity of the British population, of its cultural interests, its food, its dress.
I mean, the reason why people started emigrating to Britain, if we're talking, 40s, 50s, 60s, first of all, very often Britain went out and invited people to come into, was the Windrush generation, for instance, because they needed people to work, so people came in from the Caribbean. So there's a group of people who were actively invited to come. Others, obviously, knew about Britain or heard about Britain. And so definitely that colonial history is the reason why there's a significant population in Britain that is ethnic minority.
But I think discussion is important and awareness is important, and I think that's where schools come in, and that's where parents come in as well.
We, need to talk about it in ways that will encourage the most sort of cooperation, because it doesn't make sense for me to discuss it with you in a way that's going to make you sort of, shut down and say, oh, no, I don't want to go there. That means I haven't gained anything. Because it's not just about, raising the issue, just to raise it. That's not the point. At the end of the day, the point is to help those sections of humanity that still need a lot of help today.
Histories of enslavement, of empire, of colonialism are extremely uncomfortable reading for white Britons. But if we don't seek to understand, then we're not going to understand the structures that we need to work through and change, but also the possibilities of change itself.
It's important to learn about this history, firstly because it's important to learn about where we come from, and the history of colonialism is a major part of that history.
It gives us a better understanding of what we are looking at. It's actually the reality that's actually been happening for a very long time. What we are looking at here now is not a new manifestation. It's actually something that we could track back, for centuries. It's only through history that we can actually, unpack this, a lot more.
Colonisation shaped modern Britain, and we all still live with its legacies. By learning more about this history, we can start to understand the extent of its role in shaping Britain, and how its legacies are still with us today. It's important for us to continue exploring the history of the British Empire, so you can create a fuller picture of its impact on us.